I think we have to talk about something pretty important, and that's the identity of Final Fantasy. What makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game? Because ever since 16 was first revealed, it was hit with a massive wave of criticism from a lot of veteran fans saying, this is not Final Fantasy. I can only use one character, and the combat is fully action-based with no RPG elements. Nope, not my Final Fantasy. Which, look, 16, it's not the first Final Fantasy to receive this type of criticism. 15 got a lot of flack, especially when it came to its small cast of characters. What is this? I'm controlling a boy band? 14 got tons of flack with its poor launch. Even games like Final Fantasy VII and 6, which are beloved, have some sort of criticism from fans. And there really is so much more that goes into shaping what Final Fantasy is. It's not just purely combat or how many characters you get to control. There's a lot more to it. And thanks to Jason Schreier of Bloomberg, we got a pretty cool deep dive into that thought process where he was able to go to Square Enix and interview some people, including Yoshi P and Yoshinori Kitase, and really talk about how Square Enix has been able to keep the Final Fantasy franchise alive by constantly reinventing what it is. So this all starts back in 2015 when they're finishing up development on Final Fantasy XV, which would release the following year. The then Chief Executive Officer Yosuke Matsuda would call Yoshi P into his office to ask him to begin development on the next installment of the Final Fantasy franchise. And keep in mind, this is hot off the heels of Yoshi P and his team saving Final Fantasy XIV with A Realm Reborn, rebooting that game and making it one of the biggest MMOs on the planet. So at this point in time, Yoshi P has completely proven his worth in salt to the then president of Square Enix, giving him the confidence to ask Yoshi P to lead the next official Final Fantasy. Yoshi P would obviously accept on the condition that he'd be able to use Creative Business Unit 3, as well as bring in Hiroshi Takai to help him with this game as its director. Now, Yoshi P goes on to say, "We got absolutely no feedback from them on what we should be making. It was up to me and Takai to think, okay, what should the next Final Fantasy be?" And funny enough, this entire development team was filled with people that grew up playing Final Fantasy, and they had to be coaxed away from not sticking too close to what Final Fantasy had been in the past, those traditions that most people think of when they think of a Final Fantasy game. Yoshinori Kitase goes on to say, "They have a lot of respect for the series, but it's risky in that we might be hanging on too closely to past values." Kitase also adds that during development, Yoshi P would often come to him to ask for permission to add a feature or play around with character names. Kitase would respond, "I always tell him, there's no need to ask, you can just do what you want." Whenever he comes to me, I tell him, don't ask me anymore. Which offered Yoshida and his team a lot of flexibility, which he does acknowledge is something that's a blessing as well as a curse, stating that the last few big Final Fantasy games had major flaws. Final Fantasy XIV coming out and being incredibly buggy and rushed, and then of course there's Final Fantasy XV, which was panned pretty hard for its incoherent story. There were times where something massive would happen, a loading screen would hit, and a wall of text would have to explain what took place off screen. So it was very jarring. As much as I love Final Fantasy XV, the Royal Edition in particular, I can acknowledge that that game had some pretty big story flaws. And he goes on to say, freedom wasn't leading to success in those situations. Now, speaking on the one requirement Kitase did have that this Final Fantasy game would need, and that is crystals. Now, if you think about crystals, they've always played a pretty massive role within Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy XVI in particular has literal crystals that are powering the planet that these nations are all fighting over. And you look at something like Final Fantasy VII, while there's no like one big crystal in that game, you can look at Mako and the live stream as a metaphor for that crystal, the lifeblood of the planet that's being drained. And this stuff could technically be considered a crystal because it gets turned into materia that our characters then use in battle, but maybe that's getting a little too into semantics here. But the idea is that whether it's a literal crystal or a metaphorical crystal, these themes of crystals have permeated the franchise since the beginning. And that's what makes Final Fantasy so great, is that it can be whatever it wants to be. That's what keeps it exciting and keeps it fresh. And despite how different 16 might be, they do touch on the fact that there are a lot of traditional things in 16, including chocobos and Moogles and a man named Cid. Every Final Fantasy has to have a Cid. 16 has their Cid, and he sounds like he smokes 20 packs of cigarettes a day, and I love it. Now, this next section of the article is going to get taken out of context 100%. I'm sure it's already happening. But they ask Kitase on what the future of Final Fantasy could be. Could it potentially be something that turns into a first-person shooter? Kitase does respond by saying he'd be open to a Final Fantasy game in the style of Call of Duty, as preposterous as it may sound. And he does acknowledge that a lot of these newer ideas tend to come from the younger development staff. He says, "My imagination really has its limits, so it's really great to have a new generation of creators on board." And as crazy as a Call of Duty style Final Fantasy sounds, Yoshi P does go on to say, Call of Duty is using all this modern weaponry, but when you think about it, it's this small group of people going around saving the world. That's very Final Fantasy, he says, laughing. All it would need, he adds, is crystals. And then to end this video, we will end on a quote from Yoshi P himself saying, his definition of a Final Fantasy game is a game with a great story, great game design, cutting-edge graphics, great music, and the appearance of Moogles and Chocobos. If you have those things, I think you have a Final Fantasy, and I wholeheartedly agree with him. And that's what makes Final Fantasy so great, is that it's something different each and every time. It's a literal Forrest Gump metaphor, people. Mama always said Final Fantasy is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. Sure, some will have a sweet caramel filling and others will taste like toothpaste, but that's what keeps us on our toes. That's what keeps Final Fantasy fresh and exciting every time. That is the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think about the Metacritic scores? What do you guys think of this article talking about the identity of Final Fantasy? I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.